I woke up that morning completely unaware that my life was about to spiral into one of the most absurd battles I'd ever face. All I knew was that the sky was clear, the sun was bright, and I was running late for work again. Before I launch into this wild saga of towing companies, HOA drama, hidden repossession secrets, and revenge served extra satisfying, let me say a quick hello to all of you tuning in. Welcome to another mind-boggling Taleflow story, where HOAs and neighborhood chaos collide in the most unexpected ways. If you enjoy epic takedowns of power-hungry HOA Karens, do me a favor and like this video, hit that subscribe button, and drop a comment below if you've ever faced off against an overly controlling neighbor. Your engagement keeps these stories coming, and I'd love to hear about your own experiences. Now buckle up, because this is the ridiculous tale of how Karen tried to have my car towed, until I found out I could have hers repossessed instead. I'd lived in my neighborhood for about a year before the trouble started. In those early months, the place seemed tranquil, manicured lawns, kids riding bikes, polite waves exchanged when neighbors passed each other on the sidewalk. I'd come from a cramped apartment in a noisy city, so the quiet suburban life was a welcome change. I had no issues with the HOA at first. They sent occasional newsletters reminding us about trash schedules, yard upkeep, and holiday decoration guidelines. I followed the rules without complaint because that's just how I was raised. Respect your neighbors, maintain your space, and mind your own business. Little did I know that the newly appointed HOA president was about to turn my peaceful existence into a soap opera. I still remember the first time I heard the name Karen whispered in hushed tones during a casual block party. "Have you met Karen yet?" one of my neighbors asked me, eyebrows arched with a mixture of amusement and fear. The way he said her name made it sound almost mythical, like a cautionary tale. I admitted I hadn't. "Trust me," he warned. "You'll know her when you see her." Sure enough, a few days later, I saw a middle-aged woman marching down the sidewalk, shoulders squared, wearing an expression that dared anyone to defy her. She had meticulously styled, shoulder-length blonde hair, a clipboard clutched in one hand, and the kind of brisk, no-nonsense gait that screamed authority. She paused at every single house, scribbling notes before moving on. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe she was taking inventory of the neighborhood for some official HOA business. Within a few weeks, small signs of her leadership began to manifest. Some neighbors reported getting fines for leaving their garbage bin at the curb for an extra hour, while others were warned about the color of their curtains not matching the approved palette. Yes, you read that right. Apparently, curtains could be seen through the window, so they had to meet the association's aesthetic guidelines. We quietly commiserated about these over-the-top notices, but most folks shrugged it off, paid the fines, or made minor changes. We tried to remind ourselves that HOAs did serve a purpose, to keep the neighborhood well-maintained and property values stable. But it was clear from the start that Karen was no typical HOA president. She thrived on micromanagement and believed her clipboard gave her unlimited power. At first, my encounters with her were minimal. I'd see her packing around with a measuring tape, checking if people's hedges were trimmed to the exact height specified in the guidelines. She never wrote me up for anything. I kept my lawn cut, my hedges neat, and my trash schedule in order. I guess you could say I flew under the radar. But everything changed when I started carpooling to work with my friend Dylan, who lived 2 blocks away. He had an old sedan that he'd leave in front of my house when we took my car to the office. Then, at the end of the day, we'd drop by my house and swap cars. It seemed harmless enough. I didn't think this arrangement could possibly anger anyone. We weren't breaking any rules. Street parking was allowed as long as cars didn't block hydrants or driveways. But sure enough, one afternoon, Dylan found a fluorescent orange sticker slapped onto his windshield, courtesy of the HOA, warning him that his vehicle had been identified as unsightly and would be towed if not moved immediately. We peeled the sticker off and inspected the car. Sure, it was old, but it was fully operational, registered, and not an eyesore by any reasonable standard. No rust holes, no broken windows, no leaking fluids. It wasn't some abandoned junker. Yet apparently, in Karen's eyes, it was unacceptable to have an older sedan on the street, even though she had zero official basis for calling it a violation. We were puzzled but complied, assuming maybe we'd parked too close to a neighbor's mailbox or something else minor. We started parking on my driveway instead, tucking Dylan's car neatly beside mine to avoid any potential issues. In my naive mind, I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A week later, Karen banged on my door so loudly that I nearly tripped over my living room rug racing to open it. She stood there, arms folded, clipboard balanced precariously on her forearm. "We have a problem," she announced, eyes flicking past me to see if there was anyone else inside. "I've noticed 2 vehicles on your property." Her tone made it sound like I was harboring fugitives. I tried to keep my tone polite as I explained my carpool arrangement with Dylan. She narrowed her eyes, unimpressed. "The association guidelines are clear," she stated. "Vehicles must meet the aesthetic standards and not exceed the recommended limit in a single driveway." I'd never heard of a limit. The guidelines we received upon moving in mentioned no such thing. We had a decent-sized driveway, enough room for 2 cars. I calmly asked her to point out the exact passage in the guidelines that addressed this. She clicked her pen, rifled through some papers, and mumbled something about upcoming amendments. Then she stared me down. "I'm just giving you a warning. If you keep that wreck in your driveway, I'll have no choice but to tow." Alarm bells went off in my head. You can't just tow someone's car from their private driveway unless it's legally abandoned or something similarly extreme. Dylan's car was no showpiece, but it was fully licensed, insured, and parked with my permission. Still, I kept my temper in check, telling her politely that the car was in good working condition, and I saw no reason why the HOA could forcibly remove it. She just smirked, tapped her clipboard, and said, "I can." Then she turned on her heel and left. It was my first real taste of her style, blunt intimidation. In the days that followed, I combed through the official HOA documents to see if Karen had any legitimate angle. I couldn't find a single rule about a maximum number of cars in your driveway, nor anything about the age or condition of said cars. We were up to date on fees and not in violation of anything else. It all seemed like an empty threat on her part. I tried to let it go. But as you might imagine, Karen wasn't done. One day, Dylan called to say he'd be leaving his sedan at my place for the weekend because he was going out of town with friends, and they'd all be taking a different vehicle. I saw no problem with that. On Saturday morning, I peered out my window to see a tow truck creeping along the street. My heart skipped a beat. I immediately ran outside in my pajamas, waving my arms frantically. The tow truck driver rolled down his window, looking somewhat sheepish. "HOA sent me," he said, holding up a form that bore the signature of none other than Karen. Sure enough, it claimed Dylan's vehicle was abandoned and violating multiple community guidelines. I told the driver in no uncertain terms that he had no right to remove a legally parked vehicle from my private driveway. He seemed uncertain, so I threatened to call the police if he attempted to hook it up. Eventually, after some back and forth, the driver sighed and said, "You gotta sort this out with your HOA. I'm just doing my job," then drove off. I was shaking from the confrontation, but also relieved. I immediately fired off an email to the HOA board, demanding an explanation and attaching proof that the car was owned, insured, and authorized to be on my property. The next day, I received a curt response from the HOA's official email, but the language was suspiciously Karen-esque. It claimed that older vehicles might degrade property values and that they had the right to remove them if they felt it necessary. The entire thing was riddled with made-up references to guidelines that didn't exist. It was obvious that Karen was fabricating rules on the fly. This was the final straw for me. I decided it was time to investigate Karen more thoroughly. If she was trampling on people's rights, maybe there was some skeleton in her closet that would put her on the defensive. I'm not usually one for digging into people's personal affairs, but she declared war on me without any legitimate cause. 2 nights later, I attended an open HOA meeting, which was supposedly about common landscaping concerns. But I knew Karen would be there. I sat in the back, biding my time as she droned on about uniform flowerbed colors. After the meeting ended, I overheard a small argument between Karen and a neighbor who was upset about a series of fines for excessive bird feeders. That alone was indicative of her mindset. She was controlling everything, even how many bird feeders a person could have. I mustered the courage to approach her myself. "Excuse me, Karen," I said, folding my arms and trying to keep a neutral expression. "You tried to have my friend's car towed again. I want to know on what legal grounds." She looked at me like I was an annoying fly buzzing around her face. "Legal grounds? The HOA documents give me broad authority. We are trying to keep the neighborhood up to standards." She rattled off some nonsense about preserving property values. I told her I'd read the documents thoroughly. There was nothing that allowed her to tow a functional car from a private driveway without a court order or real cause. She tilted her chin upward and sneered, "Then maybe we need to update the documents. I can make that happen, and if you don't like it, you can move." My blood boiled. Her arrogance was staggering, but I kept my cool. "We'll see about that," I said quietly, then left. Realizing I was dealing with a bully who believed she was untouchable, I decided to do some detective work. An old friend of mine, Amanda, worked at a local bank. I'd heard rumors that Karen was behind on her HOA dues ironically enough, or that she had other financial troubles. I figured it might just be gossip, but if she was meddling in my finances by threatening towing fees, why not see if there was any basis to the rumors? I couldn't just ask Amanda to violate privacy laws, so I asked for general information about the patterns of car repossessions in our area or if any local HOAs had special loan arrangements. She told me she couldn't get into specifics about any customer, but she did say that recently, a repossession company had asked her bank for details on a woman in our neighborhood. She didn't name names, but her description, middle-aged, controlling, lived in the better part of the subdivision, felt eerily familiar. I started to wonder if Karen was behind on her car payments. If so, that might explain her obsession with policing other people's vehicles. Maybe she was transferring her financial frustrations onto us. Let's be clear, I never rejoice in other people's hardships. But Karen had made my life a nightmare over a non-issue, going so far as to call a tow truck multiple times. So if she was in a precarious position with her own car, it was at least a partial explanation for her hostility. Maybe she was projecting, or maybe she thought she could distract from her own overdue bills by harassing others. My curiosity piqued, I started paying close attention to the vehicle Karen drove. It was an expensive SUV, the kind that cost a small fortune and had every imaginable upgrade. I'd see her cruising around, checking for violations every so often. One evening, I noticed her SUV in her driveway and a man in a dark uniform walking around it, jotting notes on a clipboard. I looked closer, and I realized it was someone from a repossession agency. That was my first tangible clue that the rumor might be true. Karen happened to be away at the time, so the man eventually left without taking the SUV. But I was intrigued. If she was behind on her payments enough to have a repo agent scoping out her car, it was only a matter of time before they came back. Meanwhile, the tension between me and Karen escalated. She continued making snide remarks when I saw her around the neighborhood. She also sent a formal HOA notice claiming I was storing unapproved vehicles on my property, this time referencing my own car, a slightly older but still reliable sedan. She claimed it was bringing down property values. I laughed aloud when I saw that letter. My car was a 2015 model, well-maintained, no rust, nothing that could rationally be called an eyesore. It was evidently just her new excuse to harass me. I took a red pen, circled every false statement, wrote, "You have no legal grounds" across the top, and mailed it back. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was a Friday. I left the house at about 7:30 a.m., coffee in hand, to find a tow truck parked right in front of my driveway. My car had already been hitched up. My heart sank. This time the tow operator wasn't idling, waiting for me to intervene. He was actively raising the car onto the rig. I rushed over, practically spilling coffee all over myself. "What are you doing?" I demanded. The driver looked up, somewhat apologetic. "HOA says the car is a violation." I pointed to my registration sticker. "It's insured, it's up to date, and it's on private property. You can't just take it." He shrugged, saying he had an order with the homeowner association's signature. "Then the association is lying to you," I snapped, pulling out my phone. "I'm calling the police." He grimaced but didn't lower the rig. As I dialed, I saw a figure stepping out of the house next door, phone in hand, triumphant grin on her face, Karen. "That car does not meet our neighborhood standards," she declared. "You can't keep ignoring the rules." The tow truck driver, caught in the middle, told me he'd give me 2 minutes to produce proof that this was illegal, or he'd tow the vehicle to the impound lot. I was fuming. "Karen, I'm telling you, you have no authority to do this." She put on her sweetest, most condescending smile. "Oh, but I do. The board supports me, and we have new guidelines that require vehicles to be no older than 5 years. If you'd shown up to the last meeting, you'd know." It was utter nonsense. No such guideline existed in any official, legally binding sense. But the tow truck driver only saw an official-looking document that Karen had presumably forged or manipulated. I told the driver, "Let me call the police and show them the HOA bylaws. If you take this car, you're committing theft." Karen's smug expression faltered a bit at the word theft. She tried to wave me off, but at that moment a patrol car, likely responding to my 911 call, appeared at the end of the street. The officer got out, walked over, and asked what was going on. I explained that my car was legally parked on my driveway and that the HOA was fabricating reasons to have it towed. Karen interrupted, throwing around phrases like common interest community and emergency removal, but the officer calmly asked to see the official HOA documents. Karen handed over a piece of paper. I watched the officer's face as he read it. I saw his eyebrows inch upward in confusion. He then asked if she had the official CC and RS, covenants, conditions, and restrictions on hand. She claimed she didn't need them because this is an internal matter. The officer told the tow truck driver to stand down while he sorted out the confusion. The tension was thick. A few neighbors crept onto their lawns, quietly observing. Karen's face was growing red, but she maintained that cloying tone of certainty, insisting she was right. I retrieved my printed copy of the CC and RS, which clearly stated that no homeowner's car could be towed unless it was abandoned or inoperable for more than 30 days or blocking emergency services. The officer scanned it, then asked Karen to point to any language that supported her claim. She jabbed a finger at her forged addendum, but the officer shook his head. This doesn't appear to be an official amendment. It's not notarized, it's not included in the official record, and it's lacking board signatures aside from yours. He turned to me. As far as I can tell, you're in the clear. I'm going to advise the tow operator to release your car immediately. The driver shrugged, muttered an apology, and lowered the rig. Karen huffed, accusing the officer of not understanding HOA law, and stormed off in a fury. That was the day I realized two things. First, Karen was escalating from petty threats to actual attempts at theft. Second, she clearly believed she was above the law, but she'd made a crucial mistake, bringing the police into it. Now there was a record of her actions. I decided enough was enough. If she was brazen enough to keep forging documents and harassing me, I was going to find a way to make her stop for good. That same afternoon, purely by coincidence, I got a call from Amanda at the bank. She told me that the repossession agent who had visited Karen's house had come in again, asking more questions. Something about inability to contact the owner. That piqued my interest. I confirmed with Amanda that the man had the correct address, our subdivision, and she said yes. She still couldn't give me private financial details, but I gleaned that Karen was definitely in trouble with her car payments. I spent a few evenings researching how repossession laws worked in our state. I discovered that if the borrower consistently missed payments, the lender had the right to repossess the vehicle. Typically, the repo company tries to track down the car at the borrower's home or workplace. But if the homeowner hides the car in a garage or behind a fence, it can be harder. The repossession agent might leave if they can't locate it easily or if they can't access it safely. Karen, with her large fenced property, was probably stalling them. But eventually, they'd come at a time when the gate was open or the vehicle was on the street, just like she tried to do with my car. A plan began to form in my mind, a plan that straddled the line of sweet revenge and moral satisfaction. I realized that if Karen wanted to keep playing the game of I can tow your car, maybe it was time for her to experience the joy of having her own car forcibly removed. But I had to ensure everything was on the up and up. I wasn't about to break the law or collude with the repo man in some shady deal. Instead, I simply made it easier for him to do his job. After all, he had every legal right to repossess her SUV if she wasn't paying for it. One evening, I discreetly chatted with him when I saw him cruising the neighborhood, clearly scouting for Karen's car. I explained who I was, that I had no personal relationship with him, but I seen him around. Then I mentioned that the SUV he was looking for was often parked in the driveway on Tuesday mornings, since Karen had a standing appointment at the local salon and usually left by 10 a.m. The man listened, nodded, and thanked me for the information. If she's behind on her payments, that's her business. I'm not telling you anything that breaks laws, I'm just a neighbor. He smirked, understanding the subtext perfectly. I didn't have to wait long. The following Tuesday at around 9:45 a.m., I was sipping coffee in my living room, peering through the curtains. There it was, Karen's shiny SUV sitting in her driveway with the gate wide open, presumably so she could back out easily. And there was the repo truck rolling into the cul-de-sac like a lion stalking prey. My heart pounded, not in fear, but in a sort of gleeful anticipation. The driver wasted no time. He jumped out, quickly latched the hooks onto the SUV's undercarriage, and started the lifting process. Part of me expected Karen to burst out of her house screaming, but minutes passed in eerie silence. Maybe she was in the shower or on the phone. Finally, right as the truck began to pull away, her front door flew open, and Karen dashed out in a robe, hair half wet, face twisted in outrage. She shouted at the repo driver, demanding he stop. He calmly produced the official paperwork, taped to a clipboard, showing her name, the outstanding loan amount, and the repossession order. "You can't do this," she screeched. "I'm the HOA president. I'll have your job, I'll. But the man simply smiled, told her she'd have to contact her lender, and drove off with her precious SUV in tow. I stepped outside onto my porch, crossing my arms as I watched the scene unfold. Karen spun around, eyes landing on me. She was beyond livid. "You," she hissed. "You had something to do with this, didn't you?" I shrugged in feigned innocence. "Maybe if you stayed current on your payments, you wouldn't have to worry about your car, or if you had given me the same courtesy about my driveway as you wanted for yours, we wouldn't be here." She sputtered, threatening to write me up for harassment, but it was a hollow threat. She had no car to cruise around the neighborhood in, issuing ridiculous fines. The dynamic had shifted. For the next few days, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip about Karen losing her SUV. Some people snickered at the poetic justice, remembering how she'd tried to tow or fine them for the most trivial issues. Others felt sympathy for her financial struggles, but not for the way she'd treated everyone else. I learned from a neighbor on the HOA board that Karen was furious, trying to pass more emergency amendments aimed at punishing me specifically for meddling in private affairs. But it was laughable. She had zero evidence I'd orchestrated anything illegal because I hadn't. I simply provided a bit of timely information to someone who already had a lawful reason to seize her car. Meanwhile, the board members took a closer look at Karen's forged documents. It turned out that she'd never actually gotten official approval for many of her so-called amendments. She was just creating them in her home office, printing them out, and claiming they were legitimate. Once the rest of the board discovered the extent of her deceit, attempted towing, harassing neighbors, forging guidelines, they called an emergency meeting. Karen tried to argue that everything she did was in the neighborhood's best interest, but that obviously didn't fly. The board voted to remove her as HOA president immediately, pending a formal investigation into her misuse of authority. She stormed out of the meeting in a huff, but the damage was done. I'd love to say the story ended there, neatly wrapped up with a bow. But Karen tried one last desperate move. She filed a police report claiming I had colluded with the repo man to steal her SUV. It was laughable. Even the officer who took her statement sounded embarrassed as he asked me a few cursory questions. I showed him the text from the bank rep with personal info redacted and pointed out that if she was behind on payments, the lender had every right to repossess the car. He nodded, took a few notes, and let me know it was highly unlikely any charges would be filed. Sure enough, a couple of weeks later, the matter was closed. Karen's attempt to spin the narrative backfired spectacularly as more neighbors came forward to share her petty acts of revenge and intimidation. In the aftermath, a new HOA president was appointed, a soft-spoken man named Henry, who apologized profusely on behalf of the association. He assured everyone that they would revert to the original guidelines, hold transparent votes on any changes, and avoid the shady dealings that had become the norm under Karen's rule. He even convened a town hall-style meeting so residents could voice their grievances and suggestions without fear of retaliation. It felt like the neighborhood was healing from a collective nightmare. Karen, on the other hand, was rarely seen around after that. Some said she moved out, ashamed or simply fed up with having lost her power. Others claimed she was still in the neighborhood, sulking and plotting a return to the board, but nothing came of it. A few times I saw her waiting at the bus stop with her arms folded, looking utterly miserable. Without her SUV, she lacked the mobility to terrorize every corner of the subdivision. Karma, it seemed, had caught up with her in the best way possible. As for me, I continued living my life, free from the fear that any moment a tow truck might descend upon my driveway. Dylan and I kept our carpool going with no further threats or warnings. The sense of relief was palpable. Our neighbors, especially those who had been bullied or fined for ridiculous reasons, thanked me for exposing Karen's hypocrisy. I tried not to take too much credit, reminding them that the real downfall was Karen's own misguided assumption that she was above the law. She'd pushed one too many people, and eventually everything came crashing down. Sometimes people ask if I feel guilty about helping the repo man find her SUV. My honest answer is no, because what Karen did to me and others was unconscionable. She used her position to bully people, forging rules, forging documents, and attempting to tear away our personal property. She needed a wake-up call, one that reminded her she wasn't invincible. And that's exactly what she got. If anything, it was a necessary lesson in empathy and humility. Whether she learned that lesson is another story, but at least she can't inflict her tyranny on us anymore. The funny thing is, the entire fiasco taught me a valuable lesson about standing up for myself. For years, I'd been someone who avoided conflict, who'd rather keep the peace than make enemies. But Karen's relentless campaign pushed me to realize there are moments when you have to fight back, and do so with a sense of strategy and calm rather than blind rage. It's not about descending to their level. It's about using the tools of fairness and law to protect yourself. I also think about how the neighborhood itself changed after Karen lost her position. Meetings became less tense, more community-oriented. We started planning events, cookouts, holiday decoration contests, even a car show once a year to celebrate the very vehicles Karen despised. The environment turned friendlier. People who had once hidden behind closed doors for fear of being fined now decorated their lawns with whimsical gnomes, flamboyant yard lights, or even an extra bird feeder or two, secure in the knowledge that no one would yank it out of their hands. Property values didn't plummet. In fact, they held steady or even rose as the neighborhood gained a reputation for being family-friendly and open rather than tyrannically controlled by one person's narrow vision. For a while, I had nightmares about stepping outside and seeing my car gone, replaced by a smug note from Karen. But those faded as the memory of her meltdown in that robe, shrieking at the repo man, took center stage in my mind. That was the turning point, the ultimate moment of justice. Of course, life isn't a movie, so it wasn't the final fade-out on a perfect ending, but it was satisfying enough to anchor me through any lingering stress. In time, the board's official investigation concluded, revealing that Karen had indeed forged multiple addendums, illegally billed residents for non-existent violations, and even tried to pocket a portion of the towing fees from the unauthorized removals she orchestrated. She was forced to return some money to the HOA's treasury, and neighbors who'd been fined for invented infractions got refunds. I wasn't surprised to learn she'd manipulated the system in every way she could. The rest of the board members distanced themselves from her, claiming they'd been duped or coerced. Some might have been genuinely tricked, while others probably turned a blind eye, afraid to challenge her. In any case, the chain of accountability finally snapped, freeing the neighborhood from her grip. Occasionally, I still see evidence of Karen's influence in the odd old rule that never got stricken from the books. For instance, there's a bizarre clause that says you can't plant pink flamingo lawn ornaments, clearly a leftover relic from her personal vendetta against tacky decorations. Henry and the new board are slowly cleaning up those outdated rules. Whenever I see a neighbor ironically place a pink flamingo in their yard, I can't help but grin. It's a small act of defiance against a regime that once seemed unstoppable. And that, my friends, is the story of how HOA Karen tried to have my car towed, only for me to discover she was ripe for a taste of her own medicine. One discreet tip to a repo man, and her beloved SUV was hauled away, never to return. It's a reminder that bullies thrive when people roll over, and they often crumble the moment someone stands up and says, no. If you enjoyed riding along on this roller coaster of neighborly insanity, please take a second to like this video, share your own stories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Taleflow if you haven't already. There's no shortage of HOA Karens out there, and you can bet we'll be here, telling all the juicy details of their well-deserved downfalls. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next tale of suburban madness.